He wasn't supposed to hear it again, not after all these years, but the letter knew his name. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, tucked between a gas bill and a grocery flyer, the kind of ordinary envelope a man barely notices until something inside it refuses to be ignored. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his porch in rural Montana, the early spring air still carrying a bite, somewhere around 42 degrees, the scent of pine drifting through the trees behind his cabin. Ranger sat beside him, still as stone, amber eyes locked on the envelope like it was breathing. Ethan turned it over once, twice, no return address, no stamp he recognized, just his name written in a careful hand that felt familiar, though he couldn't place it. He hadn't received a handwritten letter in years. Not since before the war. Not since before things started slipping through the cracks of his memory like snow melting through open fingers. He slid a thumb beneath the flap and opened it slowly, the paper inside whispering as it unfolded, and for a moment, the world seemed to quiet around him, even the wind holding its breath. There was only one line. Go north. He's still waiting. Ethan read it again, slower this time, as if the meaning might change if he gave it enough time. It didn't. The words stayed exactly where they were, simple, direct, and impossibly heavy. Behind him, the screen door creaked softly, tapping against its frame in the breeze, but Ranger didn't flinch. The dog rose instead, stepping closer, nose brushing the edge of the paper. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just stood there, staring up at Ethan with a quiet intensity that pressed against something deep in his chest, something old and unresolved. You feel that too? Ethan muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure what he meant by it. Ranger's ears twitched, his posture tightening just slightly, as if listening to something beyond the trees, beyond the horizon. Ethan exhaled, a slow breath that fogged faintly in the cool air, and glanced out toward the narrow dirt road leading away from his cabin, winding north through miles of forest and forgotten towns. He hadn't driven that direction in years. Not since before the memories started breaking apart into fragments he couldn't piece back together. Not since the night that refused to come back to him, no matter how hard he tried. The letter trembled slightly in his hand, though he couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else. It's nothing, he said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. Just some mistake. But Ranger didn't move. He didn't look away. He lowered his head again, pressing his nose gently against Ethan's wrist, a steady, grounding weight, and for a moment, Ethan felt something shift inside him, like a door-long seal beginning to crack open. Somewhere far off, a crow called through the trees, sharp and echoing, and the sound carried longer than it should have, stretching thin across the stillness. Ethan folded the letter once, carefully, like it mattered more than he was ready to admit, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He lingered there on the porch, staring down that empty road, the kind of road that didn't promise answers, only distance. Ranger stepped forward first, one paw onto the wooden steps, then another, glancing back just once as if to ask a question he already knew the answer to. Ethan hesitated, just for a second, the weight of years pressing against his shoulders, the quiet life he'd built threatening to hold him in place. Then he followed. The engine had not been started in 3 days, and when Ethan turned the key, the old Ford pickup answered with a low, reluctant growl, like something waking from a long, uneasy sleep. The dashboard flickered to life, dim orange lights reflecting across the worn steering wheel, and for a moment he just sat there, hands resting, listening to the idle, steady but tired, like him. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat without being told, settling in with the quiet confidence of a partner who had done this before, though Ethan could not remember when. The gravel beneath the tires crunched as they rolled forward, leaving the cabin behind, the porch shrinking in the rearview mirror until it disappeared into the trees. The road north was narrow, a 2-lane stretch cutting through miles of pine and open sky, the kind of road that carried more silence than traffic. The morning sun climbed slowly, pale and distant, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the air coming through the cracked window carried that cold, clean scent of mountain wind and thawing earth. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel, the other brushing occasionally against his jacket pocket, feeling the outline of the letter like it might vanish if he did not check. He told himself it was nothing. A coincidence. A wrong delivery. But the farther they drove, the less that explanation held. Ranger had not taken his eyes off the road. Not once. Every few miles, his ears would shift, catching something Ethan could not hear, and once, just past a faded mile marker that read 112, the dog let out a low, steady breath, not quite a sigh, not quite a warning, something in between. Ethan glanced at him. "You have been on this road before, have you not?" he asked quietly, the word surprising even him. Ranger did not look back. He simply adjusted his posture, leaning slightly forward, as if urging the truck to keep moving. They passed through a town just before noon, the kind of place that seemed paused in time, a single gas station, a diner with a flickering neon sign, and a row of buildings that had not been painted in years. Ethan pulled in for fuel, the pump clicking loudly in the stillness, and while he stood there, he noticed something odd. A wooden post near the edge of the lot, weathered and grey, had a small metal tag nailed into it. It was not new. It had been there a long time. But the moment his eyes landed on it, something in his chest tightened. The tag was scratched, almost unreadable, except for one word that had survived the years. North. Ethan stepped closer, drawn without thinking, his boots echoing softly on the cracked pavement. Ranger was already there, sitting beside the post, staring at it like it mattered. "That is not possible," Ethan whispered, though he did not know what he was arguing against. He reached out, fingers brushing the cold metal, and in that instant, a flash of something passed through him. Not a full memory. Just a fragment. A road. A voice. Laughter carried on the wind. Then it was gone. He pulled his hand back, breathing a little heavier now, the world around him sharpening as if it had just been adjusted into focus. The gas pump clicked off behind him, the sound snapping the moment in two. Ethan turned, finished up, and climbed back into the truck, but the quiet certainty he had held onto before was slipping. This was not random. This was not an accident. As they pulled back onto the road, the sky ahead seemed wider, the horizon stretching farther than it should, and the line between past and present felt thinner with every mile. Ranger shifted again, placing one paw lightly against Ethan's leg, grounding him, steady, like a silent reminder that he was not walking this road alone. Ethan nodded once, more to himself than to the dog, eyes fixed forward now, the question no longer if they should continue, but how far this road was willing to take them before it gave them the truth waiting at the end. The road narrowed after the last town, the painted lines fading into cracked asphalt, then into a stretch of gravel that whispered beneath the tires like something being remembered instead of traveled, and Ethan felt it before he understood it, that quiet pull in his chest, not pain, not quite fear, something older, like a name on the tip of his tongue he could not say out loud. The sky had shifted by then, the pale blue deepening into a colder shade, clouds drifting low and slow across the mountains ahead, and the air coming through the window carried a sharper edge, dropping closer to 38 degrees as the elevation climbed. Ranger had not moved much, but there was a tension in him now, subtle, coiled beneath his stillness, his eyes tracking the road with a focus that felt almost human. Every so often, he would lift his nose slightly, catching the wind, then settle again, as if confirming something only he could sense. Ethan drove in silence, the hum of the engine steady, the rhythm of the tires grounding, but his mind was not quiet. The fragment from the gas station lingered, that flicker of laughter, a voice just out of reach, and it pressed against him now, asking to be let in. He tightened his grip on the wheel. "Not yet," he murmured, though he was not sure who he was speaking to. The road curved sharply along a ridge, opening to a wide valley below, dotted with trees still bare from winter, their branches reaching upward like they were waiting for something that had not come yet. A wooden sign appeared ahead, half buried in brush, its paint peeling, letters faded but still legible if you slowed enough to read them. Cold Hollow Road. Ethan's breath caught slightly, not from recognition, but from the way the name settled into him, heavy, like it belonged somewhere inside him even if he could not place it. Ranger shifted immediately, sitting up straighter, ears forward, his entire posture changing in a single, decisive movement. Ethan noticed. "This is it not?" he asked quietly. The dog did not answer, but he did not need to. Ethan slowed the truck, gravel crunching louder as they turned onto the narrower path, trees closing in on both sides, the light dimming as the branches overhead thickened into a loose canopy. The temperature dropped another few degrees, the air damp now, carrying the scent of earth and old wood, like something left behind too long. They drove for what felt like miles, though the odometer only marked a few, the road winding deeper into the forest until it finally opened into a small clearing, unexpected, almost hidden. Ethan eased the truck to a stop. The engine idled for a moment, then he turned it off, and the silence that followed was immediate and complete, broken only by the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Ahead of them stood a structure, barely visible at first, blending into the landscape like it had grown there. A cabin. Old. Weathered. The wood darkened by years of snow and sun, the roof sagging slightly at the edges, windows clouded with dust and time. Ethan stared at it, something in his chest tightening again, stronger now, sharper, like the edge of a memory pressing forward. Ranger moved first. He jumped down from the truck, landing softly on the cold ground, then began to walk toward the cabin without hesitation, each step measured, certain. Ethan stepped out more slowly, the gravel crunching under his boots sounding too loud in the stillness. The air felt different here. He could not explain it. Thicker somehow. Like it was holding onto something. "We have been here," he said under his breath, not as a question this time, but as a realization forming in real time. Ranger stopped a few feet from the door, turning his head slightly, waiting. Not urging. Just waiting. Ethan approached, each step heavier than the last, his heartbeat louder in his ears, and when he reached the door, he noticed something that made him pause. Nailed into the wood, just beside the handle, was a small, rusted piece of metal. A tag. Military issue. The chain long gone, but the tag itself still intact, worn but readable. Ethan leaned closer, his breath catching as the letters came into focus. The name was not his. But it was one he had not heard in years, not out loud, not even in his own thoughts, because some names carried too much weight to be spoken easily. Lucas Hayes. The world seemed to tilt slightly, not enough to unbalance him, just enough to remind him that something he had buried was no longer staying buried. Behind him, Ranger let out a low, quiet sound, not a growl, not a whine, something softer, almost like recognition. Ethan reached out slowly, fingers hovering just above the tag, then stopping short of touching it. His voice came out quieter than he expected. "You were not supposed to still be waiting." And for the first time since the letter arrived, Ethan understood that whatever had led them here was not finished guiding them yet. The door did not open easily, not because it was locked, but because it had not been touched in a long time, the wood swollen slightly from seasons of cold and thaw, the hinges resisting with a slow, aching creak that seemed too loud for a place that had learned to live without sound. Ethan pushed gently at first, then a little more firmly, until it gave just enough to let a thin strip of grey light spill into the cabin. The air that drifted out was still and cool, carrying the faint scent of aged timber, dust, and something else beneath it, something human, something that had not entirely faded. Ranger stepped forward without hesitation, crossing the threshold like he had done it before, his paws silent against the worn wooden floor. Ethan followed more slowly, pausing just inside as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The space was small, simpler than he expected, a single room with a narrow cot against the far wall, a table near the window, and a cast iron stove tucked into the corner. Everything was covered in a thin layer of time, dust settled evenly across surfaces, undisturbed, except for one place. The table. Ethan's gaze locked onto it immediately. Ranger was already there, standing beside it, head lowered, staring at something resting in the center like it had been waiting. Ethan approached, each step careful, deliberate, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his weight, and as he drew closer, the shape on the table came into focus. A folded piece of paper. Cleaner than everything else. Newer. Or at least, less forgotten. Ethan stopped just short of it, his breath steady but shallow, the same quiet tension building again in his chest. "That is not possible," he whispered, though the words felt weaker now, less certain than before. Ranger glanced up at him briefly, then back to the paper, as if reminding him why they had come. Ethan reached out, his fingers hovering for a moment before finally making contact, the texture of the paper dry and real beneath his skin. He unfolded it slowly. The same handwriting. The same careful strokes. But this time, there was more. "You took longer than I thought." Ethan felt the words settle into him like a weight he could not shift. His jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of something passing through his eyes, not anger, not fear, something closer to recognition struggling to surface. "I do not remember writing this," he said quietly, though the thought had already begun to form before the words left his mouth. He read the line again, slower, tracing each letter like it might unlock something buried beneath it. Ranger moved closer, pressing gently against his side, grounding him in the present even as the past began to stir. Ethan exhaled, a long breath, and looked around the room again, this time with different eyes. The cot. The blanket folded neatly at the foot. The boots placed beside it. Worn but positioned with care. This was not abandonment. This was waiting. His gaze returned to the table, to the letter in his hand, and then beyond it, to something else he had missed at first. A second object. Smaller. Rectangular. A journal. Its cover darkened with age, edges softened from use, resting just beside where the letter had been placed. Ethan hesitated, only for a moment, then set the paper down and reached for the journal. The leather felt familiar in a way that unsettled him, like shaking hands with someone he should know but could not place. He opened it carefully, the spine bending with a quiet crack, revealing pages filled with writing, line after line in the same hand as the letter. His hand. Ethan's breath caught slightly, his eyes scanning the first page, then the next, the words pulling him in before he could stop himself. Dates. Notes. Fragments of days that felt both distant and close. And then a line that made everything else fall silent. "If you are reading this, it means Ranger found you again." Ethan froze, the world narrowing to that single sentence, the edges of the room blurring as something deep inside him shifted, something long held back beginning to break through. Behind him, the wind moved through the trees, a low, steady whisper against the cabin walls, and for a moment, it almost sounded like a voice carried from somewhere far away. Not calling. Not urging. Just present. Waiting, the same way everything here had been waiting, not for time to pass, but for him to finally arrive. The words did not fade after he read them, they stayed, pressed into his mind with a quiet certainty that refused to loosen, and Ethan felt something inside him begin to shift, not all at once, but in slow, deliberate pieces, like a door opening one hinge at a time. He lowered himself onto the edge of the cot without realizing it, the journal still open in his hands, the paper slightly trembling though his grip was steady. Ranger remained close, settling at his feet, his presence calm and unwavering, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, not with urgency, but with patience that stretched beyond time. Ethan looked down at the page again, his eyes moving more carefully now, no longer scanning, but absorbing, letting each word land where it needed to. The entry continued in the same familiar hand, steady, grounded, unmistakably his. "You will not remember how we got here. That is why I wrote this." Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze softening just slightly, the resistance he had carried for so long beginning to loosen its hold. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the cabin, a low, constant sound, like breath moving through something unseen. He turned the page. "We came north because we said we would. Not for orders. Not for duty. For him." The sentence lingered, and with it came another fragment, clearer this time, a voice not far away, laughing softly, calling his name across a stretch of open land. Ethan blinked, the image flickering, then fading, but leaving something behind. Not emptiness. Not confusion. Something closer to understanding waiting just beneath the surface. He swallowed once, then continued reading. "He did not make it back with us. But he made it here." Ethan's hand tightened slightly against the page, not out of tension, but out of recognition forming in real time. He did not make it back. The words echoed, not as a shock, but as something he had always known, just never allowed himself to fully see. Ranger shifted closer, resting his head gently against Ethan's boot, the contact grounding, steady, present. Ethan reached down without looking, his fingers brushing against the thick fur between the dog's ears, and for a moment, the simple act anchored him more than anything else. He turned another page. I told him I would come back. Even if it took time. Even if I had to find my way again. Ethan's breath caught, just slightly, the edges of memory pressing closer now, not forcing their way in, but waiting to be accepted. The cabin around him felt different now, less like a place abandoned, more like a place held together by something unseen, something that had been waiting not for anyone, but for him specifically. His eyes moved to the next line, slower this time, each word carrying weight he could feel in his chest. If you are here, then you kept your promise. Ethan closed his eyes. Briefly, not to escape, but to steady himself, the words settling into something deeper than thought. A promise. Not a mission. Not an order. Something personal. Something chosen. When he opened his eyes again, the room seemed clearer, the light through the window softer, warmer, as if the space itself had shifted with him. He looked down at Ranger, who lifted his gaze in return, quiet, knowing, and Ethan felt it then, fully for the first time since the letter arrived. This had never been about finding a place. It had always been about finding a moment he had left behind. He ran his hand slowly along the dog's head, his voice barely above a whisper. You remembered when I could not. Ranger did not move, did not need to. He simply stayed, steady as ever. Ethan looked back at the journal, one final line written at the bottom of the page, smaller than the others, almost like an afterthought, but carrying the greatest weight of all. He is not alone. And neither are you. The words did not demand anything. They did not explain. They simply existed, quiet and certain, like the cabin, like the road, like the presence that had guided them here without ever needing to be seen. Ethan sat there for a long moment, the silence no longer empty, but full, not of answers, but of something stronger than answers. Understanding, finally beginning to take shape. The silence inside the cabin did not feel empty anymore, it felt occupied, as if something unseen had been waiting patiently for years and had finally been acknowledged, and Ethan could feel it in the way his breathing slowed, in the way the tightness in his chest began to loosen, not completely, but enough to let something else take its place. He closed the journal gently, his hand lingering on the cover as though it might disappear if he let go too quickly, then he stood, the movement slow and deliberate, like a man learning the weight of his own body again. Ranger rose with him, immediately attentive, his posture relaxed but aware, his presence steady in a way that required no words. Ethan looked around the cabin once more, not searching now, but seeing, really seeing, the small details he had missed before. The way the blanket on the cot had been folded with care. The boots placed side by side, toes facing the door, ready for a step that had never been taken. The stove, cleaned, emptied, left in a state that suggested not abandonment, but intention. Someone had prepared this place not to leave it behind, but to hold it in waiting. Ethan moved toward the window, the glass slightly clouded but still clear enough to see the stretch of land beyond, a gentle slope leading into the trees, the late afternoon light settling into a soft gold that warmed the edges of everything it touched. For a moment, he simply stood there, his reflection faint in the pain, overlapping with the world outside, and in that overlap, something aligned. Not memory. Not fully. But something close enough to feel true. He turned back toward the door, his eyes briefly resting again on the metal tag nailed beside it, Lucas Hayes, the name no longer distant, no longer something he could keep at the edges of his mind. You made it here, Ethan said quietly, not expecting an answer, not needing one. Ranger stepped ahead of him as they moved outside, the cool air greeting them again, sharper now as the sun dipped lower, the temperature falling closer to 35 degrees. The forest seemed different in the fading light, the shadows longer, the spaces between the trees deeper, but it did not feel threatening. It felt still. Ethan walked a few steps away from the cabin, his boots pressing into the soft earth, and then he noticed it. Just beyond the clearing, where the grass gave way to a patch of darker soil, there was a small rise, subtle, almost easy to miss if you were not looking for it. Ranger was already there, standing beside it, not moving, not calling attention, simply waiting. Ethan approached slowly, each step carrying a weight that was no longer confusion, but understanding forming in real time. When he reached the spot, he stopped, his gaze lowering, taking in the shape of the ground, the way it had been carefully formed, not by nature, but by hands. There was no marker. No name. Just a quiet place that had been chosen with care. Ethan knelt down, the movement natural, unforced, his hand resting gently against the earth, the coolness of it grounding, real. For a moment, he said nothing. There were no words that felt necessary, no explanations that needed to be spoken. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it that same faint scent of pine and distance, and Ethan felt it then, not as a thought, but as a certainty settling deep within him. He had not come here to find Lucas. He had come here to finish something he had started. He glanced at Ranger, who lowered himself beside him, calm, present, as he had always been, as he had always remained, even when Ethan had forgotten. "I should have come sooner," Ethan said quietly, the words simple, unadorned, but carrying everything they needed to. Ranger did not respond, not in any way that required sound, but his presence alone was enough, a quiet acceptance, a reminder that time did not erase what mattered, it only waited for it to be remembered. Ethan let his hand rest there a moment longer, then slowly stood, the weight he carried no longer pressing down, but settling into something steadier, something he could carry without breaking. The light continued to fade, the sky shifting toward evening, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not feel lost in it. He turned slightly, looking back toward the cabin, then out beyond it, toward the road they had taken to get here, and he understood now that the journey had not been about distance, not about miles or direction. It had been about returning to a moment that had never truly left him, waiting quietly, just like this place, just like the promise he had finally remembered how to keep. The light continued to fade, but it did not feel like an ending, it felt like something settling into place, the kind of quiet that follows when a long-held tension finally releases, and Ethan stood there a moment longer beside the small rise of earth, his shoulders no longer carrying the same invisible weight, his breath moving easier in his chest. Ranger remained close, his body pressed lightly against Ethan's leg, not demanding attention, not seeking anything, just present in the way he had always been, steady as a heartbeat. The forest around them shifted with the coming evening, shadows stretching across the clearing, the temperature dropping another few degrees as the last of the sunlight slipped behind the distant ridge. Ethan glanced down once more, his gaze soft now, not searching, not questioning, simply acknowledging. "You waited," he said quietly, the words barely louder than the wind, but they carried a depth that had not been there before. Not regret. Not guilt. Something closer to acceptance. He turned slowly, his boots pressing into the ground with a quiet certainty, and began walking back toward the cabin, Ranger moving with him in perfect rhythm, step for step, like they had done 1,000 times before, even if Ethan could not remember each one. The cabin looked different now, not abandoned, not forgotten, but complete, like a chapter that had remained open was finally allowed to close. Ethan paused at the doorway, his eyes catching the metal tag once more, Lucas Hayes, the name no longer heavy in the same way, no longer something he needed to avoid. He reached out this time, his fingers closing gently around the edge of the tag, the cold metal grounding, real. For a moment, he simply held it there, not pulling it free, not trying to take it with him, just feeling the presence of it, the connection it represented. "I made it back," he said softly, not as a declaration, but as a quiet truth. The wind moved again, brushing lightly through the trees, carrying with it that same faint whisper that had followed them since the road began, and Ethan felt it settle around him, not as something external, but as something that had always been there, waiting for him to notice. He let go of the tag, leaving it exactly where it belonged, and stepped inside one last time. The room was dim now, the light fading into soft grey, but everything inside felt lighter, clearer, as if the space itself had been holding its breath and had finally exhaled. Ethan walked to the table, the journal still resting where he had left it, and beside it, the letter. He picked it up again, unfolding it slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar line, then pausing. There was something new. A second line, written in the same careful hand, but lighter, almost as if it had been added recently. "You found your way." Ethan stared at it for a moment, the words settling into him without resistance, without confusion. He did not question how it had appeared. He did not try to explain it. Some things did not need explanation once they were understood. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table, exactly where it had been, not as something to take, but as something to leave behind. Ranger watched quietly, his eyes following every movement, calm and certain. Ethan turned once more, taking in the room, the cot, the window, the small details that had carried so much meaning without ever asking to be seen. Then he stepped outside, closing the door gently behind him, the sound soft, final, but not heavy. The clearing stretched out before them, the sky now deepening into evening blue, the first hint of stars beginning to appear above the tree line. Ethan took a slow breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and for the first time in a long time, it did not feel like he was searching for something beyond the horizon. He looked down at Ranger, a faint, quiet smile touching the corner of his mouth. "We can go home," he said, the words simple, but this time they carried direction, not distance, not escape, but return. Ranger's ears lifted slightly, his tail giving a small, steady movement, not excitement, not urgency, just acknowledgement. They walked back toward the truck together, the gravel crunching softly beneath their steps, the sound no longer echoing, no longer hollow, but full, grounded. Ethan paused at the door, his hand resting briefly against the frame, then he climbed in, Ranger following, settling into his place as if nothing had ever been out of place at all. The engine started easier this time, the low hum steady, familiar, and as they turned the truck back toward the road, the cabin remained behind them, quiet, complete, no longer waiting, because what it had been holding had finally been found. And as they drove south, away from the cold and the silence, Ethan did not look back, not because he was leaving something behind, but because for the first time, he was carrying it with him. Exactly as it was meant to be carried. The road stretched quietly beneath them as the truck moved south, the tires humming against the asphalt in a steady rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat returning to normal after a long strain, and Ethan kept his eyes forward, not because he was avoiding what was behind him, but because there was nothing left there that needed to be chased. The sky had darkened into a deep blue, the last traces of daylight fading along the horizon, and the temperature had dropped closer to 32 degrees, the cold air slipping through the slightly open window and brushing against his face with a sharp, clean edge. Ranger sat beside him, calm, composed, his posture relaxed now in a way it had not been before, as if something inside him had settled as well, a task completed without ever needing to be spoken aloud. The road curved gently through the forest, the trees thinning as they descended, the darkness breaking into patches of open sky where the first stars had begun to appear, faint at first, then clearer with each passing mile. Ethan adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his movement slower, more deliberate, not weighed down, but aware, like a man who had finally found where to place the things he had been carrying. He reached into his jacket pocket out of habit, his fingers brushing against the empty space where the letter had been, and for a moment, he paused, not in confusion, but in recognition. He had left it behind. Not forgotten. Not lost. Left. The distinction mattered now. A soft exhale left him, almost a breath of quiet acceptance, and he let his hand rest there a moment longer before returning it to the wheel. The road sign passed on the right, barely visible in the dim light, marking the miles as they moved farther from the place that had waited for him, but the distance did not feel like separation. It felt like completion. Ranger shifted slightly, placing his paw once again against Ethan's leg, the same grounding gesture as before, but this time it carried no urgency, no need to guide, only a quiet presence that said the path ahead was his to walk freely. Ethan glanced at him briefly, a faint softness in his eyes, then returned his gaze to the road. "You did not just bring me there," he said quietly, his voice steady, "you brought me back." Ranger's ears twitched slightly, but he did not look away from the road ahead, as if even now, his focus remained not on what had been done, but on what still lay ahead. The miles passed without effort, the small towns they crossed now feeling different, not like places frozen in time, but like points along a journey that no longer needed to be questioned. The gas station from earlier appeared again in the distance, its single light glowing faintly in the dark, and as they passed it, Ethan noticed something that made him slow just slightly. The wooden post was still there, weathered and grey, but the metal tag nailed into it was gone. There was only the wood now, bare, as if whatever purpose it had served had already been fulfilled. Ethan did not stop. He did not turn back. He simply nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and continued driving. The road widened as they moved farther south, the forest giving way to open stretches of land, the horizon expanding, the sky above them now filled with stars, clear and steady, each one holding its place without wavering. Ethan felt it then, fully, not as a thought, not as something he needed to name, but as a quiet certainty settling into his chest. The journey had not changed what had happened. It had changed how it lived inside him. Ranger shifted again, settling deeper into his seat, his breathing slow and even, the steady rise and fall matching the rhythm of the road, and Ethan found himself matching it without realizing, his own breath falling into that same quiet pattern. They drove on, the night stretching ahead, not endless, but open, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not feel like he was following something unseen. He was simply moving forward, with nothing left pulling him back, nothing left asking to be found. And somewhere in the quiet space between the hum of the engine and the distant glow of the road ahead, there was a peace that did not demand attention, did not announce itself, but stayed, steady and certain, like a promise finally kept. The road did not feel long anymore, even as the miles continued to pass beneath them, each one measured not in distance, but in something quieter, something steadier, and Ethan kept driving with the same calm focus, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his shoulders no longer carrying the tension that had once settled there like a second weight. The night had fully taken hold now, the sky stretched wide and clear above them, scattered with stars that seemed brighter the farther they moved from the mountains, each one fixed in place, unhurried, unchanged. Ranger shifted slightly in his seat, his breathing slow and even, his presence no longer guiding, but simply sharing the road, and Ethan glanced at him briefly, a small, almost unnoticeable smile forming at the corner of his mouth before fading back into something quieter. The truck moved through another stretch of open land, the trees thinning into fields that rolled gently beneath the dark sky, and the air coming through the window had softened, losing the sharp edge of the higher elevation, settling into something more familiar, something closer to home. Ethan reached the turnoff just before midnight, the narrow dirt road leading back toward his cabin barely visible in the dim light of the headlights, but he did not hesitate. He turned without slowing, the tires crunching softly over gravel, the sound grounding, real. The trees closed in around them again, but this time it did not feel like entering something unknown. It felt like returning. The cabin appeared through the branches exactly as he had left it, quiet, still, the porch untouched, the faint outline of the roof catching the light just enough to stand out against the darkness. Ethan parked the truck and turned off the engine, the sudden silence settling around them, familiar now, not heavy, not empty, just still. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ranger stepped down first, his paws landing softly on the ground, his body stretching slightly before he turned back, waiting without urgency. Ethan followed, closing the door behind him, the sound echoing lightly before fading into the night. The air here felt different, warmer by a few degrees, the scent of pine still present but softer, blended with the quiet familiarity of a place that had not been waiting, but had simply remained. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his boots making a dull sound against the wood, and paused there, his gaze drifting across the dark outline of the land around him, the trees, the sky, the space that had once felt too quiet, too empty. It did not feel that way now. He reached into his pocket again out of instinct, his fingers brushing against nothing, and this time he did not pause. He let his hand fall naturally to his side, the absence no longer something to question. Ranger moved closer, settling near the steps, his body relaxed, his attention drifting not outward, but inward, as if even he understood that there was nowhere left to go, nothing left to search for. Ethan opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar creak greeting him, the interior just as he had left it, simple, unchanged, but not the same. He moved through the space slowly, not inspecting, not checking, just existing within it, his presence filling the quiet in a way it had not before. He stopped near the small table by the window, his hand resting lightly against its surface, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not to remember, but to feel, The weight that had once followed him into every room, into every silence, was no longer there. Not gone. Just no longer pressing. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, the same soft sound that had followed them north, that had waited in the clearing, that had whispered through the cabin walls, and now it was here too, not as something separate, but as something that belonged. Ethan opened his eyes again, his gaze steady, calm, and he spoke quietly into the stillness, not expecting an answer, not needing one. "I am here." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the space around him, into the walls, into the quiet, and something in that moment felt complete, not in a way that ended something, but in a way that allowed everything to remain exactly as it was meant to be. Ranger lay down near the door, his body relaxed, his eyes half closed, the steady rhythm of his breathing filling the room with a quiet, living presence, and Ethan stood there a moment longer before turning toward the window, the faint light of the stars visible through the glass. He did not think about the road behind him. He did not think about what might come next. He simply stood there, present, steady, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to follow, nothing left to find, because the thing he had been searching for had never been ahead of him at all. It had been waiting, patient and unbroken, for him to remember how to return.